Good afternoon and welcome to the Collision and Towers Liability webinar. If you were able to attend the Protection Indemnity webinar we presented a couple of weeks ago, you'll remember we set this subject up. This will be a fairly short webinar, but this subject is absolutely critical when you're constructing true marine coverage. And I'll show you some of the dangers if you do it wrong. Collision is pretty obviously the impact of a ship, a vessel, against another vessel. Allision, which is a different thing we talked about in the P&I seminar, is the hitting of a ship or a vessel against a dock or any other fixed or floating object. But we're talking about collision here today. You also hear me refer quite a lot to towers liability. And collision and towers really go hand in hand. The towers liability is the liability you have to another vessel in tow. Most commonly this would be tugs with a set of barges behind or in front of them. It's towers regardless of whether they push them or pull them. But the two coverages are very much interlocked in the brown water, in the river type of business. Collision liability, though, is the main part of this exercise and where the traditional structure can go drastically wrong if you don't do it properly. Here's the clause out of the American Institute hull form. If the vessel shall come into collision with any other ship or vessel, and the insured or the surety in consequence being the vessel being at fault, shall become liable to pay and shall pay by the way of damages to any other persons, the underwriters will pay the proportion of such sum or sums to respective subscriptions thereto, provided that the liability in respect of any such collision shall not exceed the proportionate value of the agreed value. So what does all that mean? It means that in the hull policy you automatically get the same value, the same agreed value on your vessel as third-party physical damage against another vessel. You hit that other vessel and you've got third-party physical damage. You don't get bodily injury, there's no BI, there's no damage to anything other than that vessel and its cargo that might be aboard. The towers liability clause is very similar. It just adds if you strand or come into collision, or your tow comes into another collision with another vessel, it just adds that to the same form. This is the American Institute Tug Form 1976 version. Again, one of the most common tug forms that's in use today. Again, no bodily injury provided in either of these forms. Bodily injury comes out of your P&I policy. This is the physical damage only to those third-party vessels. It's worth noting here in the towers section, you also have liability to the freight of her tow. So in those barges are full of some expensive freight, that also is covered under this particular clause. So let's look at the current traditional structure of how you put this together. Your first level of insurance comes from your own hull insurance that we've just shown you in those two clauses. Pays the same limit as your hull. And you could be a $250,000 hull towing or colliding with a multi-million-dollar vessel. So you need more coverage than just what is provided in the hull. And the P&I goes a long way to do that because the primary P&I policy pays the difference between the hull insurance and the P&I insurance. We'll look at some physical numbers for this in just a moment, but we're going to assume that your primary P&I is $1 million. On top of that, you have an excess P&I. I've put an arbitrary limit in here of $4 million. But by adding all those together, you get all the protection that you might need. You might want to buy higher limits than $4 million, of course, but you get all those protections in those three separate policies. So let's look at a real life example. Here I've got a tugboat that's valued $250,000. It runs into a multi-million-dollar ship, does a lot of damage, and we're just talking about again the damage to that other vessel, and the hull policy is going to pay that $250,000 first for the damage to the third-party ship. Now in the hull policy you've also got another $250,000 to pay for the damage to your own vessel. So in fact you've got at least two limits, and in fact when you go through the policy you'll find there's a couple more limits that are separate. So we've got $250,000 to pay for our own vessel, and in this case $250,000 to pay for the damage to the third party vessel. We've then bought that $1 million P&I policy, and remember it pays just the difference between the $250,000 hull value and the P&I policy limit. Again, my example is $1 million. So we end up with $750,000 limit, $750,000 of limit available under the P&I policy. And then we got a $4 million excess policy in my example. So for that third party collision, you add those three together, you got $250,000 out of the hull, $750,000 out of the P&I, $4 million out of the excess. You've got a total coverage available of $5 million. Again, this is the traditional structure. We'll talk about how some underwriters will change this in some cases and whether that's a good idea in just a minute. But that's the traditional structure. Now let's show you where this goes wrong. Same scenario, but our tug's now worth $1.2 million. We've got a hull policy that can pay $1.2 million. That's good news. We've got a little bit more in the hull policy than we had in the last example, quite a lot more in the hull policy. But then we get to the P&I policy, and the P&I policy has a $1 million limit. So there's no gap between the hull policy and the P&I policy. So that primary P&I policy pays nothing. Problem is, we have an excess P&I policy. An excess P&I policy requires the primary policy to pay. So because the primary policy didn't pay anything, neither does the excess. So straight excess P&I policy will not cover you if the attachment point is higher than the primary limit. In other words, if the value of the hull is equal to or greater than the primary P&I limit, this type of structure collapses. And what you end up is total coverage of $1.2 million. And this was a real life E&O. I've rounded the numbers a little bit, but a real life E&O for an agent down in South Florida. I put the coverage together and their vessel ran into a cruise ship doing multi-million dollars worth of damage. Again, this doesn't consider any bodily injury to crew or to anybody else. This is purely the physical damage to the vessel you collide with. Here's the problem particularly, is it is very simple to fix this. A lot of you use the American Institute falling form excess clauses. If you don't, most umbrella policies have the same ability to cover excess collision liability. This is one of the biggest changes when you walk into the marine world. That dividing line between physical damage policies and liability policies is just not as clear cut as you would find in a typical property casualty market. So the idea of scheduling a physical damage policy as an underlying in a liability program seems a little wrong. All you've got to do when you issue this American Institute full of form excess policies, click the box as covered, put an X in it, put a check mark in it, whatever your particular system allows, and write against it included. Collision liability if you just got a ship, towers liability if you have a tugboat. It's a very easy cure. And probably more interesting, it's free. I don't know anybody in the marketplace today that requires you to pay for this excess collision or excess towers liability. And frankly, that's why the agent lost their E&O, because they didn't offer something that was free. As I said, that's the traditional method of doing it. Some underwriters will try and move all the liabilities out of the hull section and move them into the P&I. And you can do that. You can add an exclusion for the collision or the tower's liability to the hull policy, and there are endorsements that add it to the P&I. Most of the underwriters or carriers that I know will tell you that's a simpler solution. Let's put all the liabilities in one basket. I would disagree. First of all, are you getting a lower deductible or are you giving a higher deductible? Your whole policy may have a $1,000 deductible, it may have a $100,000 deductible, but how does that compare to the P&I? Switching it across changes the deductible. Could be to your advantage, but it might not be. But here's the way that you will absolutely lose out on this, and that is an erosion of the limits. Remember that hull policy has a separate $250,000, or whatever the value of your hull is, to pay for that collision physical damage. If you've got here I've increased that limit to $500,000, but add that to $1 million P&I, and then for a single event you've got $1 million collision and $1 million bodily injury. And traditional policy will pay $500,000 under that hull policy and $1 million for bodily injury, so a total of $1.5 million worth of coverage. Again, $500,000 coming from the hull and $1 million coming from the P&I. If you take a converted policy, you've taken that collision liability out of the hull and dumped it into the P&I policy. You've lost that ability to collect out of the hull insurance, and so all you've got to pay for the collision, for any bodily injury, for any third-party property damage, anything else in here, you've only got that $1 million to pay for it. So in this example, you've lost $500,000 worth of coverage just by moving the collision liability from the hull to the P&I policy. What makes it interesting is you're also reducing the attachment level for an excess underwriter. So if that value was maybe $5 million, you'd be reducing the attachment for collision liabilities from $5 million down to that $1 million pooled with all the other types of coverage you get under the P&I. And we went through that in the last webinar. Excess underwriters don't seem to ask the structure, but in reality it can be a big change in where they attach on an excess collision liability claim.